I never told him about the properties. Not one word. And for a long time, I wondered if that made me a bad person. It doesn't keep me up at night anymore. My name is Lorraine, and I was 61 years old when I met my second husband at a church potluck in Asheville, North Carolina. I know how that sounds. A church potluck. Very on brand for a woman my age, I suppose. But that's exactly where it happened. Between a green bean casserole and somebody's questionable ambrosia salad, and I'm not embarrassed about it. I'd been widowed for 6 years by then. My first husband, Ray, passed from pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2018, and I spent the following years doing what you do, grieving, then surviving, then very slowly starting to live again. Ray and I had been married for 31 years. We built a life together in Western North Carolina, raised 2 kids, my son, who lives in Charlotte now, and my daughter, who's in Portland, and somewhere in all of that we also built something financially stable, nothing flashy, just solid, the kind of quiet security that takes decades of careful choices to accumulate. After Ray died, I kept going. That's the part nobody really talks about, how you just keep going, almost out of habit. I still own the 3 rental properties we'd acquired together over the years. A duplex in West Asheville, a single-family home in Black Mountain, and a small 2-unit property in Weaverville. All 3 were paid off. No mortgages. Ray and I had made that a priority. We never wanted to carry debt into our 60s. We managed them ourselves for years, and after he passed, I hired a small property management company to handle the day-to-day. It wasn't glamorous work. Leaky faucets, late rent checks, the occasional difficult tenant, but those properties generated enough income every month that I didn't have to touch my retirement savings. I could just live, quietly, comfortably, on my own terms. I wasn't looking for anyone. I want to be clear about that. I had my routines. I had my book club and my garden and my Wednesday morning walks with my neighbour. I had my grandchildren on holidays. I had enough. But then my friend dragged me to that potluck, and I sat down at a folding table next to a man named Gerald, and he made me laugh 3 times in the first 15 minutes, and something in me shifted a little. Gerald was 64, retired. He'd spent his career as a high school history teacher and then a department head in the local school district. Trim, silver-haired, easy smile. He talked about his students the way people talk about their own children, with this genuine affection that I found immediately disarming. He'd been divorced for about 9 years. No bitterness about it, or at least none that showed. He just said it hadn't worked out and left it at that. We talked for 2 hours at that potluck. He asked for my number before I left. I gave it to him. What followed was 6 months of the most unexpectedly lovely courtship I'd experienced since my 20s. Gerald brought flowers, not every time, just sometimes, which was actually better. He remembered things I mentioned in passing, things I'd half forgotten saying. He was punctual and considerate, and he held doors open, not in a performative way, but just because that was how he moved through the world. He called when he said he would. He showed up when he said he would. My daughter was cautiously supportive. My son asked me if I was happy. I said yes. And I meant it. Gerald had a daughter from his marriage, a woman in her late 30s named Renata, who lived about 40 minutes away in Hendersonville. I met her about 3 months in. We had dinner at a restaurant in downtown Asheville, just the 3 of us, and she was pleasant enough, polite, made conversation, asked me appropriate questions. I remember thinking she seemed a little guarded, but I chalked that up to the situation being awkward for everyone. Meeting your father's new girlfriend at any age is strange territory. I liked Gerald. That was the honest truth. I liked him very much. And when he proposed at a quiet dinner at his house, no grand gesture, just the 2 of us and a ring that had belonged to his mother, I said yes. We were married in the spring, small ceremony, family only. It was a good day. I remember the light being beautiful. I had not told him about the rental properties. Let me explain why. because I know how it sounds. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't strategic, not at first. It started as something closer to self-protection that I couldn't quite name at the time. When Ray died and I was suddenly a widow in my mid-50s with meaningful assets and no partner, I learned quickly that people's behavior toward you can shift in ways you don't expect. Not dramatically, just subtly. A little more interest, a few more questions, friends of friends suddenly wanting to be introduced. I became careful, not paranoid. Careful. There's a difference. When I started dating again, I made a quiet decision to keep my financial situation private until I was absolutely certain about a person. I didn't lie. I just didn't volunteer. If someone asked what I did, I said I managed some property and left it at that. Most people didn't push. Gerald didn't push either. He knew I had some rental income. I'd mentioned it vaguely early on. He knew I was comfortable. He didn't know the specifics, didn't know the properties were fully paid off, didn't know what they were generating each month. And I kept it that way, even as we got more serious. My attorney, a woman I'd worked with since Ray died, had been urging me for years to hold the properties in an LLC rather than my personal name. We'd finally done that about 18 months before I met Gerald. 3 properties, 1 LLC, all properly documented. When Gerald and I married, those assets were legally distinct from any marital property. I also insisted on a prenuptial agreement. I told Gerald it was simply something I needed for peace of mind, given that I'd spent decades building what I had. And to his credit, he didn't fight me on it. He said he understood. He signed it. I remember feeling relieved when he signed it without drama. I thought, this is a man who respects boundaries. This is someone I can trust. I wanted to be right about that. The first few months of our marriage were good. We were figuring out the rhythms of sharing a life, whose house we'd live in, how we'd handle finances, all of it. We decided to keep separate accounts and contribute equally to a joint account for household expenses. Gerald's pension and social security covered his half comfortably. My rental income covered mine. It worked. Then his daughter started coming around more. I don't want to be unfair to Renata. The early signs were small enough that I second-guessed myself each time. She began stopping by the house unannounced, which Gerald seemed to find perfectly normal. She was his daughter, after all. She'd make comments about the house that were just slightly off, observations about how we'd done things that felt like they were actually assessments. She asked me once, in a tone I couldn't quite read, whether I planned to keep all my properties going or whether I might simplify things now that I was remarried. I remember going still when she said that. I hadn't told her about the properties in any detail, which meant Gerald had. I didn't say anything. I just said I hadn't really thought about it and changed the subject. But I started paying attention differently after that. About 8 months into the marriage, Gerald sat me down one evening with what I can only describe as a rehearsed casualness. He said he'd been thinking about our financial future. He said that at our age it made sense to consolidate, to think about things holistically rather than in separate silos. He used the word silos 3 times in that conversation, which I remember because it didn't sound like Gerald. Gerald talked about his students and his vegetable garden and the Civil War. He didn't talk about financial silos. He suggested we look into merging our assets more formally. He said he'd been speaking with someone, a financial advisor, he said, who had thoughts about optimizing our combined portfolio. He said the rental properties, given their value, were really the anchor of our overall picture, and it might be worth sitting down with this person together. I said I'd think about it. That night I called my attorney. She listened to everything I told her, and then she asked me a few quiet, careful questions. Did Gerald's name appear anywhere on any of the property documents? No. The LLC predated the marriage, and my name was the only one on the LLC membership. Was there anything in our prenuptial agreement that could be interpreted as covering the LLC's assets? No. We'd been specific. Was I being pressured to do anything in writing? Not yet, she said. She told me to document everything going forward. Dates, what was said, who was present. She told me to be pleasant and non-committal if the topic came up again. She told me not to sign anything without her review. And then she said something that I've thought about many times since. She said that people who love you don't need access to your assets. They just need you. Over the following weeks, the conversations continued. Gerald brought up the financial advisor again. I said I'd been busy. He mentioned that Renata had done some research and had some ideas she wanted to share. I said that was thoughtful of her. He asked once directly what the properties were currently appraised at. I said I'd have to look back at the last assessment. I never followed up with a number. Then one Saturday afternoon, I came home from running errands to find Renata at the kitchen table with Gerald, and spread out between them were papers I recognized immediately. They were printouts, tax records, property records from the county assessor's website, the kind of public information that anyone can access if they know what they're looking for. She'd been doing her homework. She looked up when I walked in, and for just a moment before she rearranged her expression, I saw something that I can only describe as calculation. We were just looking some things over, Gerald said. I can see that, I said. I set down my grocery bags. I poured myself a glass of water. I sat down at the table across from both of them, and I looked at those papers, and I thought about Ray, who had worked his whole career and invested carefully and never took shortcuts, and I thought about those 6 years I'd spent alone managing everything and keeping everything going, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger. Something quieter than that. Clarity. What exactly were you hoping to find? I asked. There was a pause. We're not trying to be intrusive, Renata said. We just think it makes sense to have the full picture, as a family. I see, I said. Gerald said something about wanting us all to be on the same page. He said that at our stage of life, transparency was important. I looked at my husband. I'd tried to find the man who'd made me laugh at that potluck, who'd brought flowers sometimes and not every time, who'd signed the prenup without a fight and said he understood. I looked for him and I wasn't entirely sure what I was seeing instead. I'll tell you what, I said. I'm going to make an appointment with my attorney, and if you want to have a conversation about any of this, we can do it there, with her present. The temperature in that kitchen dropped about 10 degrees. I won't pretend the next few months were easy. They weren't. Gerald became distant in a way that was hard to articulate. Still present, still technically a husband, but there was something withdrawn about him, something that felt like disappointment. Renata stopped coming around, which was honestly a relief. The financial advisor was never mentioned again. My attorney was thorough. She reviewed everything twice. She confirmed that the LLC structure was airtight. The rental properties had never been marital assets, and nothing about our marriage or the prenuptial agreement had changed that. Whatever Gerald and Renata had been hoping to find in those county records, they'd found nothing actionable. My son flew in from Charlotte and sat with me at my kitchen table while I told him everything. He didn't say, "I told you so." He's not that kind of person. He just listened and then said, "Mum, whatever you decide, we support you." My daughter said the same thing in a long phone call from Portland. What I decided in the end was that I couldn't unknow what I knew. A marriage is built on a foundation, and I'd watch my husband sit at my kitchen table with his daughter while she went through public records looking for leverage. That's not a misunderstanding. That's not a rough patch. That's a revelation of character. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Gerald and I separated 14 months after our wedding. The divorce was not dramatic. The prenuptial agreement meant there was very little to dispute. He kept what was his. I kept what was his. I kept what was mine. The duplex in West Asheville had a vacancy that spring, and I found a nice young couple to move in. The house in Black Mountain needed a new water heater, and I arranged for that. The 2-unit in Weaverville was fully occupied and running smoothly. I checked in with my property manager, reviewed the numbers, and everything was exactly as it should be. I still go to that church. I still go to the potlucks occasionally, though I'm more selective about which table I sit at now. People ask me sometimes if I regret remarrying. I don't, actually. I learned something I needed to know, that my instincts were right, that the structures I'd put in place were right, and that protecting yourself is not the same as closing yourself off. It just means you're paying attention. My attorney put it better than I could when we finally closed out all the paperwork. She looked at me across her desk and said, "You did everything right, Lorraine. The only thing that went wrong was who he turned out to be." I drove home through the mountains that afternoon with the windows down. October light in western North Carolina is something else entirely, golden and slanted and absolutely unearned by the calendar, like a gift nobody asked for. I still have the properties. I still have my house. I still have my house. I still have my name on my LLC documents, clean and uncontested. And I still have myself, which after everything is the part that matters most. If you're a woman in your 50s or 60s thinking about remarrying, I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm not telling you love isn't real or that people can't be trusted. I'm telling you to do what my attorney told me years ago, before any of this happened. Keep your name on your own things. Know what you own. Understand what's yours before you introduce anyone else into the picture. Not because everyone has bad intentions, but because you spent decades building your life, and the only person who has been there for all of it, every decision, every sacrifice, every difficult year, is you. You owe that person some protection. If this story stayed with you, I'd ask you to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've been through something like this yourself, if you've had to protect what you built, leave a comment. I read every single one. I've thought about this a lot since everything settled, what caused what, and why things unfolded exactly the way they did. Gerald didn't become a different person after we married. That's the part that took me a while to accept. He was always that person. I just didn't have enough information yet. And the reason I came out of it whole, with the duplex and the Black Mountain house and the Weaverville units all still in my name, all still generating income, all still mine, wasn't luck. It was the accumulation of decisions I'd made long before I ever met him at that potluck. The LLC, the pre-nuptial agreement, the years of keeping my own counsel and not volunteering information just because someone seemed trustworthy. Cause and effect isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet preparation, meeting a moment you hoped would never come. What strikes me most, looking back, is how much of what protected me came from a kind of discipline I'd practiced for years without fully naming it. After Ray died, I had to figure out who I was outside of a partnership. That was hard, but it also forced me to get clear on what I owned, what I was responsible for, and what I was unwilling to compromise. That clarity, that hard-won, unglamorous clarity, is what saved me when Gerald sat down at my kitchen table with Renata and those county records. I think about the woman I was at 55, grieving and exhausted, signing paperwork to restructure those properties into an LLC because my attorney thought it was prudent. I wasn't thinking about a second husband. I was thinking about a second husband. I was thinking about estate planning and liability protection. I had no idea I was also building a wall that would one day hold. That's how it usually works, I think. The choices that protect you are rarely made in the moment of danger. They're made years earlier, in ordinary moments when you're just trying to be responsible. And the intelligence required, I don't mean book intelligence, I mean the kind that comes from paying attention, from noticing when words don't match behavior, from trusting the small cold feeling in your chest when something is off. That's built slowly too. It's built every time you choose not to ignore something that bothers you, every time you pick up the phone and call your attorney instead of telling yourself you're probably overreacting. What I want anyone to take from my story isn't suspicion. It isn't don't trust people or protect yourself from everyone. It's simpler than that. It's know what you have, understand it, keep your name on it, And when someone you love gives you a reason to pay closer attention, pay closer attention, pay closer attention, that's not cynicism, that's self-respect. Lorraine walked out of that marriage with everything she'd built intact, not because she was lucky and not because Gerald was unusually terrible, but because she'd done the quiet, unglamorous work of protecting herself before she ever needed to. The strength wasn't in the confrontation at the kitchen table. It was in every careful decision that came before it. That's the part worth keeping.